Wes McDermott. This is Chapter 2 of Unity Crash Course, and we're looking at the third video. In this video, we're going to take a look at the scene view, the hierarchy view, and the toolbar. So in this video, we're going to be covering basically the hierarchy view and the scene view, and we're also going to take a look at this toolbar. So we're going to be concentrating kind of on this area here of the UI. And then also, what we're going to do is just, again, make sure that we are inside of our layout. So if you need to, make sure that you're inside your default layout if you want to follow along with the video. Okay, so hierarchy view and scene view. So our hierarchy view is pretty much like we touched a little bit on it in the project browser, but it's basically like a list view of your scene. So it's very simple. It's just basically an outline of everything that's happening here in your game. And you build your game up through the hierarchy view. So for instance, let's say that I have let's just go back. Here we go. Let's use our favorites here, and let's just say, give me a model, and let's do this catwalk here. So if I want to bring this catwalk into my scene from the project browser, it's just left-click, drag and drop, and just place that here into my scene. And here's that element is now here in my scene. So I'm just going to undo that. But that's how you bring your assets into the hierarchy view. And then everything is just, it's a very kind of just an outline, kind of linear view. Just scroll through to kind of look at what you got here. And you've got these little drop-down arrows here. So as you start to create kind of like parenting structures and things like that, you can do that. And so we'll talk about that in a later video. You also have the ability to search for things. So let's just say that I want to search for, let's just say crate. So as I start to type in crate, you can see that that shows up. What's really cool about this feature is in the scene view, you can see that everything else kind of almost grays out, and then that the crates or whatever I had selected will actually show up in the scene view, in the 3D view. That's very cool. So we'll go ahead and just hit this little close button here to kind of close that out, and you can see that now I can see everything in my scene view. We have this little drop down button here so we can search by all, by name, or by type. So again, very similar to kind of how we worked with the project browser. And then finally, with the scene view, what you can do is you have this little create tab. So if we just click on this guy, you can get this little context menu here, and this lets us create all types of different game objects. So let's just say that we want to, here we've got like particle effects, cameras, our lights are in this section here. Here's our geometry, and so on. So let's just say that we want to create a cube. I'm just going to create this cube. And if I just kind of scroll up here, the item selected in the hierarchy view has got this kind of like this blue bar around it. So again, as I kind of click through these guys, you can see that we've got this little widget, this little transform widget here, this with the green and blue and red arrows is kind of indicating, what I've actually selected. And also in the hierarchy view here, you can see that again, that blue bar shows up to let us know what is selected. So we created a cube. It's in our scene here, and we can see it based off where this transform manipulator is placed. And so again, we can use the create menu to create game objects here in our scene. So let's just go ahead and grab this guy, and I'm just going to delete him as well. And so that's basically the nuts and bolts of our hierarchy view. So the hierarchy view and the scene view go together as we start to create things. So it's just like the project browser where we saw kind of like a list view here in our project browser, and then we got to see like an expanded view here in the second column. You can kind of think of that similar into the scene view. So we basically have kind of like this text outlined form of all of our game objects, and the scene view is actually the 3D version of that. So Unity is a world builder, and it is completely done in 3D. You can create things in 2D, so can you create like 2D platformer games and that kind of stuff? Yeah, sure you can. But really what you have is basically, flat 3D elements kind of like on cards, so to speak, or sprites as they'll call them, and you are still arranging those in a 3D space. And so we have this 3D view. And so the first thing that we're going to want to learn how to do is how do we navigate this 3D view? So navigating in the 3D scene is actually pretty simple. I want to bring your attention up to these buttons here. Let's just take a look at this first button. And so it looks like a hand. So I've got this guy clicked, and you can see when I come over into or move my mouse into this the scene view here, and if I just left click and move my mouse around by holding it, so it's left click and drag, and you can see I'm basically panning my scene around. And that's just like if you took a piece of paper and you put it on a desk, and you put your hand on the paper and just start moving it around the desk. You're basically panning your scene around. So that's kind of what that's like. And there's a couple different ways that this button kind of works. So if I were to hold down a modifier key, so let's just hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, you can see that the button changes to an eyeball, and in the in the scene view, that hand turns into an eyeball as well. And now if I just left click and drag with the Alt key held down, I can now start to rotate around. So I'm just basically left click and drag, let go of my mouse button, reposition my mouse, left click and drag, and following that type of movement there, I can actually rotate around my scene or orbit my scene in any way possible. So you can see that I can, rotate towards the top, rotate towards the bottom. I can kind of move around in this scene. And you can see that, again, as long as the Alt button is pressed, we've got that little eyeball icon. If I let that go, I'm back into pan mode. So you could navigate, like, basically leave this here, and you can pan around. You can hold down the Alt key to rotate, let go of the Alt key, and now the left click button and dragging takes us back into that pan mode. Something else that we can do is if we have the Alt key held down and we hold on to the right mouse button, so if we click the right mouse button and drag or basically move our mouse forward towards us, we can zoom into our scene, or if we push our mouse away from us, we can zoom out of our scene. So again, if we go back to let go of the Alt, we can pan, hold down Alt and left, we can rotate and hold down Alt and right, and we can zoom. So those are the three ways that we can kind of work with our scene. Now, with that said, and what that button does, I never use that. What I actually do is these three buttons that you see here are basically your transform manipulator. So we've got move, and you can see that here in our viewport, we can see that we've got this like transform widget. It's like you can see we got a green, red, and blue arrow kind of sticking out of this guy. That's our transform. If we click this guy, we've got a rotation, and then we click this guy again, this button here, we've got a scale. So basically what I do is I just kind of leave this guy right here into this transform, and then what I do is just use the Alt and button as a modifier key. So we have our transform widget selected. If I just hold down Alt and left click, I can left click and drag, I can rotate my scene. If while holding down Alt and I right click, so pushing the mouse forward and backward, I can zoom in and out of my scene. And with Alt still selected, and then if I just click and drag the middle mouse button, I can pan my scene. So this is the way I work. I do Alt, left click will rotate, Alt middle will do the pan, and then Alt right will do my zoom in and out. You can see that this icon is still changing for us, but as soon as I let go of that Alt key, I go back into my transform manipulator. And I find this to be the best way to work. That way I'm not constantly having to go up to my UI and click this button. Okay, now let's say I kind of zoom in on my scene, so I'm still using the hold down Alt, right to zoom, middle to pan, left to rotate. I kind of get in on this object. Now I still got this hand icon. I'd have to come over and I'd have to select the move tool. So if I want to move this guy, then I want to pan my scene again, I got to go back. So I don't do that. I just keep it into the move tool and then just use the hotkeys of holding down the Alt. Here I am using Alt right to zoom out, Alt middle to pan, and Alt left to rotate. So now that we've covered orientating ourselves around the scene using the mouse and the keyboard, I want to bring your attention to this kind of view cube here. So as I start to hold down the Alt key and left click and drag, I'm starting to tumble or rotate around my scene. You can see this view cube is rotating with me. The cube itself is, if you think about this guy, it's basically showing us what our world axis is. So we've got Y is up, Z is forward, and X is left and right. And so if I want to actually rotate my view into like an orthographic view, let's say that we want to take a look at the scene from a top-down view. Let's go ahead and just click, and as I start to rotate over one of these axes here, you can see that it highlights. Let's click our Y-axis, and you can see that it rotates the view into a top-down view. Let's click our X-axis. You can see that rotates it into a side view, and then we can click our, let's see, if I want to go back into perspective view, all I got to do is hold down the Alt key and just left-click again. That'll put me into my perspective view. But if I want to go into a front view or the Z, I'll just click the Z-axis, and now I'm into that front view. We've got a little indicator here at the bottom that lets us know what view we're in. So again, if we click the X, you can see that we're in the right. As we start to kind of rotate this guy around, you can see that it's changing. So here's our bottom view. Just clicking one of these axes, you can see that I'm changing my views. And again, if I want to go back to perspective, just Alt left, and you'll go right into a perspective view. Something else that you can do is you can actually toggle between the perspective view and an isometric view. So right now you can see that this is indicating that we are in a perspective view, which is actually showing perspective in 3D space. If we click this middle cube here, it's going to take it into an isometric view. So we're still in 3D space, but what that does is just removes all of 3D perspective. So basically there's no converging lines into our perspective view. I actually don't ever use this view very often. Well, actually the only time I would really use this view is if I'm actually in one of my orthographic views. So let's say we go into our Y view, our Y axis. You can see that here's our top-down view, and it's a bit easier to work with versus if I'm in my Y axis and I click my left view here, or the middle cube, and now I've actually introduced some perspective into this. So it may be a little bit more difficult to kind of work in this scene if we're actually looking at this scene with perspective. So again, if I'm in my top view and I want to kind of remove all perspective, all I got to do is just left click onto this cube, and that's going to drop us into isometric view, and this may be a little bit easier to work with if you're actually inside of one of your orthographic views. So again, I'm going to get out of this. I'm just going to alt left click and just kind of introduce some perspective to this guy. I'm going to click this middle box, the cube, the middle cube here, and now we've got our perspective view is in place. So now that we've talked about being able to translate around our 3D view here, our scene view, let's go ahead and talk about translating objects. So we've got these buttons at the top. The first one here I have selected is the move. If I go ahead and click this next one, we've got rotate and scale. So these are our translate operations that we can use, or our translate tools. And as I toggle in between each one of these, you can see that the transform gizmo in the scene view actually changes. So that's our move. This is what the rotate gizmo looks like, and then finally this is what the scale looks like. We can translate, rotate, and scale on individual axes. So if you take a look at, in the case of translation, if I just click on this Z-axis arrow here, I can actually move this guy constrained to the Z-axis. And if I click the Y, I can move in the Y. Same thing with scale. So let's go over to our scale. You can see that I can actually scale this guy in the X, I can scale in the Z, and then finally in the Y. If I click the gray cube in the middle, I can do a proportional scale on all three axes. Let's also go back to our rotate real quick, and you can see same thing here. So we can rotate on the X and on the Z. If I just kind of click in between this gizmo here, I can free rotate between all axes. I'm just going to undo that. And one of the things, just like with being able to orbit and move and pan around into the scene, there's some keyboard shortcuts that you're definitely going to want to use with this. So like I said before, the way I kind of work with my scene is I keep this guy, I just have this button selected here, which is my move. And to actually toggle between all the states, I just use the keyboard shortcut. So W is the move tool. If I press E on the keyboard, it's going to take me into rotate, and then R on the keyboard is going to take me into scale. And so basically what I do is I just use the W, E, and R keys, as I'm also using the Alt, right, middle, and left to orbit and move around in my scene. So I'm constantly toggling in between these guys, and so I can move my objects around. And then finally, if I need to, I can actually go into one of these type of views here, or one of these orthographic views. And so another kind of shortcut with these views here, so something I use a lot, is like say that I want to just go ahead and move into an orthographic view. I can actually hold down the Shift key and just left click on one of these axes. And not only is that going to drop me into the view, but it's also going to drop me into this view with perspective turned off. So you can see right here we've got these three lines indicating that we are in a right view, but we don't have any perspective. So it's basically like an isometric orthogonal view. So again, here we'll just pull this guy back up here, and I'm just going to go ahead and click my cube here to put me into perspective mode. And something else that I want to actually mention here is that when we had talked about translating this guy here, we've got two more buttons that we want to focus on. We've got pivot and global. So right now, if you kind of look at this object, you can see that we've got this guy, and he's kind of, let's go ahead and get him selected again. He's kind of rotated a little bit, but you can see that the transform gizmo here is actually aligned to the world axis. So if I go ahead and change this guy from, and you can see that's indicated here by this button, which is labeled global. So if I click this button, you can see that we go into local mode, and you can see that the transform widget here, or the gizmo, actually changes so that it aligns itself to the rotation or the orientation that this box is in. So now I can actually translate this guy in the X based off its local space, which is going to take into consideration that rotation that's on there. So here we go. Let's go back to global, and you can see that rotating, or translating on the X based when I'm in global or world mode, you can see that that's actually just working or translating just as if it was in a world axis, which it is. And then if we turn this guy over to global, you can see that we're now being able to translate an object space or local space. We also have the ability to work with a pivot. And so a pivot is basically going to be something that you're probably going to need to set within your 3D application. So let's just say that if we wanted to work with the center So that's going to be the center of this object. So if this object is a 3D object, but the way it works is actually going to have a little bounding box around it, and the transform gizmo is always going to be placed in the center of that. However, if I have a pivot set, that's actually a pivot that's set into a 3D application, which is like a pivot point. If I turn this into pivot mode, what it's going to do is it's going to take this transform gizmo and it's going to align it to that pivot point. So in this object, it doesn't have like a custom pivot inset, so that what we're going to do is you can see that toggling between these two modes is not really doing anything for us. But I just want to let you know that that option's there, so that any kind of pivot that you set in your 3D application can also be used within Unity as well. So we're not really going to cover the inspector view just yet, but I do want to talk a little bit about how it relates here. So let me just kind of close up some of these settings here. So we're not going to worry about any of this stuff here, but I do want to show you that. So we've been working with this guy here, this crate or whatever this object here is, and we've been talking about how we can actually translate and work with this guy. So as you can see, as I start to move this guy in the X, every single object or a game object is going to have a transform to it. And so any of these transforms that you can see here, we've got position, rotation, and scale, which are going to correlate to our position, rotation, and scale operations or gizmos that we're working with here. And you can see that each one of these objects has a transform component to it, and you can actually numerically enter values in for this. So I could even, instead of just using that transform gizmo, I could actually just come over, and you can see that when I hover my mouse over this X here, I get this these two black arrows pointing left and right, and it means I can actually scrub right here into the viewport, and you can see that I can translate this guy in the X by just moving my mouse left to right. So kind of like a gesture-based translation here that I can do. Or I could actually type this in. So let's say that I want to move this over 3 units. I can do that. Same thing with the Y and the Z. So I can basically set a transform for my X, Y, and Z, rotation, and I can also set my scale this way as well. So one of the things I want to point out, you can see how all these views are relating. So we've got our hierarchy view where we're adding our objects in. So I've got it selected here. It's basically letting me look at my scene from an outline type view. So, text-based outline type view. That then translates into our scene view, which then lets me look at the same assets, but in an actual visual 3D representation of that. And then finally, each one of these objects has properties that I can set through the inspector. And in the case of how we're kind of relating these views, you can see that on this object, there's a transform that basically represents the data or what this object's made up numerically. So we've got text-based or outline type view of our asset. We've got a full 3D representation, and then finally we've got a numeric representation between these three views and how they all sync up together. So by default, we've got different ways that we can view our scene. So if we look down here, we can view it texture, wireframe. So if we go into wireframe mode, you can see that it allows us to view the wireframe of our meshes. If we go into textured wired, it's going to place the wireframe over top of the texture. And then we also have like light map resolution and render pass. Typically, you'll probably just leave this at textured. We also have the ability to look at the RGB, alpha, and overdraw. So here we are, RGB is looking at full color. Alpha mode is going to look at the alpha. If we drop this down to overdraw, this is an interesting mode that basically shades everything as transparent, and what this does is it shows where objects are being drawn over top of each other. So this is an aid that'll kind of help you determine bottlenecks in your game or issues where overdraw could be a concern. And then finally we have mipmaps. So what mipmaps does is it kind of shades our scene into a view, and it's kind of a way to determine the kind of the texture or the texel resolution of your scene. So as we kind of scroll this guy out, you can see that we're getting the scenes being shaded with kind of overdrawn with this color of red, and if we get in close, you can start to see blue. And so what these two colors are doing for us is if I start to scroll this out, basically what it's saying is when it starts to color an area of red, it means that the texture is larger than necessary at this resolution. So right now, this is saying, hey, the texture applied to this is an extremely large texture. And we're viewing at the scene, the way if we start to scroll this guy, everything's turning red, saying, hey, this object is actually being seen pretty small in the scene, and it's got a very large texture attached to it. This isn't very optimized. And then, on the flip side of that, as we start to zoom in, especially we'll look at this crate. So we're viewing this crate very up close. So it's, the camera's right up next to this guy and it's shading everything blue, saying, hey, this texture could be a lot larger for how close this camera is to the scene or how this is being rendered. So this view right here is actually kind of a good kind of view. And to help you kind of gauge your texture resolution. And then if you start to see the texture, like for instance, if we kind of look right here, we see a little bit of this orange type color, and then we see the blue. But right here in the middle, we see the texture, without any color shading over top of it. That means that this texture is actually at the where it is in this scene, in relation to where the camera is going to be rendering this. This is actually a perfect resolution. So if it's not being shaded with a color over top of it, that means it's right where it needs to be. And so we'll go ahead and drop this back to RGB. And then finally, we've got a couple toggles going on across here. So this first one right here, if we kind of hover our mouse over this is just a toggle that turns the built-in lighting on and off. So we can toggle this on and off. We also have, if we go ahead and pull this guy back, you can see that we have a skybox in this view. So if I go ahead and toggle this, you can see that turns skyboxes off. So if I look at this again, it says it will toggle skybox, fog, and lens flare effects. So if I kind of toggle this on and off, you can see that that's what that's doing. And then finally, sometimes you might have some audio sources in your scene. So what you can do is you can actually toggle this on and off. So this toggles the audio on and off as well. And then you can also see that we've got some gizmos in our scene. So here's our gizmos drop down. So for instance, if we take a look at our camera as a gizmo, or we've got lights here as I select the light. So certain type of things like lights and sounds and cameras and things like that are going to have like this, they're going to draw this little icon in the view for you. And so we can control how that looks by using this gizmos drop down. So if we select this, you can see that we got 3D gizmos, so we can actually turn that off, and you can see where that kind of changes our scene here. Let's just pull this over off to the side, and then we'll pull our gizmo up. So if we turn these on and off, this is just toggling whether these gizmos are rendered as 2D or 3D. We can actually change the size of these guys. So if we keep them 3D, we can change the size. And then as we kind of go through here, we can see that we can actually toggle icons on and off, and we can actually enable gizmos on and off for these guys. So that's what we have. We have icons on the left, and then we can actually turn the gizmo on and off on the right. So for instance, if we take a look at lights or cameras here, if I go ahead and toggle this camera off, you can see where the gizmo is turning on and off. Same thing with the light and the audio source. So let's say that I'm working in my scene and that camera icon is just really getting in the way. You can easily turn that stuff off. Or if you want to have it on for cameras, you can do that. So you have a lot of control over how much of these gizmos are actually rendering in your 3D viewport. And then we kind of covered this a little bit here in the hierarchy tab, but we also have the ability to do a search as well in our 3D scene, and we can also filter that by name and type. So again, let's take a look at that crate small. Here, let's just type this in and say crate. So now you can see that everything that's labeled with a crate, same thing as the hierarchy, is not only kind of being masked here in our hierarchy view, so we can see where these guys are, but in our scene view, you can see that everything else gets masked, and this allows us to easily look at objects that we want to look at within our scene. So this is actually really handy, especially when you have a scene with a lot of items in it. So we've covered a lot in this video, and so I want to close with just taking another look at some of those main keyboard shortcuts that you're going to use often. So remember that in our scene navigation, what we're going to do is Alt and left mouse button is going to orbit, Alt middle mouse is going to pan, and Alt right mouse is going to zoom, and then we use the F key to focus the selection. So you make a selection, hit the F key, and then it'll focus the viewport to that selection. And then finally for our translation, we'll just use the W, E, and R. So W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale.